All right, let's talk about the AZ-400. If you go out and search for the best DevOps certification right now, you're going to get 100 different answers. But if you actually want a job and not just a shiny digital certificate, there is one that recruiters consistently look for on Azure teams, and that's the AZ-400 Microsoft Certified DevOps Engineer Expert exam. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're tearing down the updated 2026 blueprint, mapping out a realistic study plan, and showing you exactly how to turn this certification into a real job offer. So, let's kick this off with a question that literally changes the game for your prep. When you look at the whole vast landscape of DevOps, source control, security, monitoring, communication, what is the single most important skill Microsoft is testing you on? Like, what's the one area you absolutely cannot fake? The answer is build and release pipelines, and they make up a staggering 50 to 55% of the entire exam. Just let that sink in for a second. Over half of your exam is about pipelines. If you only study one thing intensely, it has to be YAML pipelines in Azure DevOps and GitHub Actions integration. You could be an absolute genius at agile planning and monitoring, but if you don't know pipelines, you simply will not pass. So here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to cover the 2026 certification landscape, break down the 5 domains, check out what's new in 2026, walk through a 4-phase prep plan, discuss some exam day tactics, and finally look at landing the job. All right, part 1, the 2026 certification landscape and navigating those prerequisites. Before you even think about clicking schedule on the AZ-400, we got to talk about the new reality of the prerequisites. You can't just walk in off the street and take this expert-level exam. Microsoft requires you to prove your foundational knowledge first. And there's a really stark contrast happening right now. With the developer track, the AZ-204, retiring in July 2026, the Azure Administrator AZ-104 is now your mandatory starting line. Historically, you could choose between being a certified Azure Administrator or an Azure developer. But with that developer exam phasing out mid-year, the AZ-104 is the standard path for pretty much everyone. If you haven't started either yet, absolutely, for sure, go with the AZ-104. The AZ-400 assumes you already know Azure administration inside and out. It's testing whether you can design and implement full DevOps practices on top of that foundation. Moving on to Section 2, breaking down the 5 domains, focusing on the June 26, 2026 skills update. Okay, let's look at the actual blueprint and how these domains are weighted. Check out how massive that pipeline slice is. Designing and implementing build and release pipelines absolutely dominates at up to 55% of the exam. The rest of the test splits into these smaller supporting pillars. Process and communications sits at 15%, your source control strategy is another 15%, security and compliance takes up 10%, and finally, an instrumentation strategy rounds it out at just 5%. When you're blocking out your study schedule, your calendar honestly needs to mirror this exact weighting. Which brings us to Section 3, What's New in 2026, covering that major July 27th exam refresh. So here's the deal. Microsoft is heavily refreshing the English language exam on July 27th, 2026. If you're using old study materials or out-of-date dumps, you're going to get totally blindsided. You need to master these 4 highly specific modern practices. First up, the industry has aggressively shifted to DevSecOps, meaning security is baked right into the pipeline, not just bolted on at the end as an afterthought. Second, you really must intimately understand modern deployment strategies, things like blue-green, canary, and progressive exposure using feature flags. Third, stored secrets are dead. I mean it. Secretless authentication using Workload Identity Federation and OpenID Connect is the new gold standard. And finally, you can't just study Azure DevOps in a vacuum anymore. Microsoft is extensively testing how it integrates directly with GitHub. All right, Section 4, the 4-phase prep plan. This is your strategic blueprint to actually pass. Now that we know exactly what's on the test, let's lay out the precise sequence you should follow so you aren't just spinning your wheels for months. Phase 1 is ensuring those AZ-104 foundations are rock solid. Phase 2, you treat the official Microsoft Learn Study Guide like a literal checklist. If you can't explain a bullet point out loud to an empty room, well, that's a gap you need to fill. Phase 3 is completely non-negotiable, hands-on labs. Listen, this exam brutally punishes people who only read the theory. Go spin up a free Azure DevOps org, build multi-stage YAML pipelines from scratch, configure your environments, break things, and then fix them. That is where the real learning happens. And finally, Phase 4 is practice questions. But actually, hold off on these until you're consistently scoring over 80% on your own. You want to understand the architecture, not just memorize a bunch of A, B, C, D answers. So what does this look like on a calendar? Assuming you've already got your AZ-104 in the bag, this timeline gives you a super realistic 8 to 16-week path from day 1 to walking into the testing center. Weeks 1 and 2 are all about foundations. Weeks 2 through 4 are for digesting that study guide. Then the absolute bulk of your time, weeks 3 through 8, is dedicated entirely to those hands-on labs. And finally, weeks 8 through 16 are for hammering out practice tests and actually sitting for the exam. Of course, if you are starting from absolute zero with zero Azure experience, you really need to budget closer to 6 to 12 months for the whole journey. Section 5. Winning on exam day. Let's get into the tactics that actually move the needle. Getting to exam day is great, but sitting there staring at 40 to 60 questions, you need a cheat code. And here it is. Pay close attention to Microsoft's verbs. They are incredibly deliberate with their wording. If a question asks you to design a strategy, they're testing your architectural judgment. They want the best practice, high-level answer. But if it asks you to implement a solution, you need to know the specific command, the precise YAML syntax, or the exact portal setting. Reading the verb before you even look at the options will save you so much time second-guessing yourself. You also want to keep these critical tactics in your back pocket. Case studies are notorious for eating your clock. If you're stuck for more than 2 minutes, flag it and move on. Next, use the process of elimination. There are usually 1 or 2 answers that just straight up contradict how Azure DevOps actually functions. Cut those immediately. And whatever you do, please do not skip the hands-on lab-style questions when you're under time pressure. So many candidates fail simply because they get intimidated and skip these high-value questions. Expect GitHub and Azure DevOps integration to be featured heavily throughout the whole thing. And finally, prioritize sleep. A tired brain makes terrible architectural decisions, for sure. Finally, Section 6, landing the job. How we turn this certificate into an actual job offer. Because look, passing that 700-point threshold, that's just half the battle. A digital badge doesn't magically print job offers. You know what it does? A tangible public portfolio. Demonstrating a real pipeline on GitHub is honestly worth more in a DevOps engineer interview than the certification alone. Just think about it from a hiring manager's perspective. Anyone can memorize practice questions. But if you can hand them a link to a repository where they can literally see your multi-stage YAML pipeline, your pull request policies, and your deployment strategy in action, you prove without a doubt that you can actually do the job you're applying for. And you've got to speak the language of recruiters. Please, don't just slap AZ-400 certified on your resume and call it a day. Frame it around concrete outcomes. Use the exact keywords recruiters are actively searching for. Write down that you designed a multi-stage YAML pipeline with canary deployments and secretless authentication via OpenID Connect. When you finally get to the interview, target the right titles like Site Reliability Engineer or Platform Engineer, and be ready to talk about culture. DevOps is so much about breaking down silos. Be prepared to discuss exactly how you'd handle a failed deployment or run a blameless postmortem. I really want to leave you with this quote from the source material because it hits the nail right on the head and perfectly summarizes the mentality you need for this whole process. This isn't about memorizing trivia. It's about proving that you have the technical judgment to design secure, highly efficient, and modern deployment pipelines in really complex enterprise environments. So, with the blueprint in hand and those pipelines clearly in your sights, the only question left is this. Are you just looking to collect another digital badge? Or are you ready to actually prove your judgment and build the future of DevOps in 2026? Get that AZ-104 prerequisite lockdown, master those YAML pipelines, build out a killer portfolio, and turn this certification into your next big career leap. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.